September 15th, 1940. High above the English countryside at 28,000 feet, Flight Lieutenant Gerald Lewis squinted through the glare as his Supermarine Spitfire climbed toward the blazing afternoon sun. Below him, a formation of German Heinkel bombers droned steadily toward London, their Messerschmitt escorts weaving protective patterns around the lumbering aircraft. Lewis had spotted them minutes earlier, but rather than diving immediately into the attack, he did something that would have puzzled aviation experts just months before. He pulled back on his control column and climbed higher, positioning himself directly between the sun and his targets. What Lewis was executing represented one of the most devastating tactical innovations of the Battle of Britain, a systematic approach to aerial combat that transformed defending British pilots from desperate underdogs into invisible predators. The Germans called it impossible. Their own tactical manuals warned against it. Yet here, 30,000 feet above Kent, British pilots were turning the sun itself into a weapon that would help save their nation from invasion. The mathematics of aerial warfare were being rewritten not in training academies or engineering laboratories, but in the cockpits of Spitfires and Hurricanes, whose pilots had discovered that the oldest rule in aviation could become the newest path to victory. The principle was ancient, carved into fighter pilot doctrine since the earliest days of aerial combat. He who has the sun achieves surprise. But what British pilots accomplished during the summer and autumn of 1940 went far beyond following established doctrine. They systematized sun-based attack tactics into a coordinated defensive strategy that multiplied their effectiveness while devastating German bomber formations. The transformation began with a recognition that conventional wisdom about fighter combat needed radical revision. Traditional aerial tactics emphasized speed, altitude advantage, and superior numbers. British pilots defending their homeland possessed none of these advantages consistently. German fighters were often faster. German formations frequently held altitude superiority. German numbers seemed endless as wave after wave of Luftwaffe aircraft crossed the English Channel. Yet British pilots discovered they possessed something the Germans could not replicate or counter. They could choose when and where to engage. They could position themselves between their enemies and the sun, and they could turn that positioning into devastation. The story of how British pilots weaponized sunlight against the Luftwaffe reveals principles that extended far beyond individual combat techniques. It demonstrates how tactical innovation can overcome technological disadvantages, how systematic thinking can transform natural phenomena into military advantages, how defending forces can exploit their intimate knowledge of local conditions to neutralize superior attacking capabilities. Most importantly, it shows how desperate circumstances can drive revolutionary thinking that changes the fundamental nature of warfare itself. The foundation of sun-based attack tactics rested on a simple biological reality. Human vision cannot function effectively when looking directly into bright light. Aircraft designers had not solved this problem because it could not be solved through engineering. No amount of technology could allow pilots to see clearly while staring into the sun. This fundamental limitation created an opportunity that British pilots learned to exploit with devastating precision. The physics of the situation was straightforward, but required careful understanding to implement effectively. An attacking aircraft positioned between the sun and its target became nearly invisible to enemy pilots, who would be forced to look directly into blinding glare to spot the approaching threat. The attacking pilot, however, could see his target clearly silhouetted against the darker background below. This asymmetric advantage meant that British fighters could approach German formations undetected, close to effective firing range, and deliver surprise attacks before their presence was discovered. But understanding the principle and implementing it effectively under combat conditions required skills that went far beyond basic flying ability. British pilots needed to calculate approach angles that maximized the sun's blinding effect while maintaining adequate visibility for accurate gunnery. They had to coordinate their attacks with other aircraft while remaining concealed. They needed to time their strikes to coincide with optimal sun angles throughout different periods of the day. Most challenging of all, they had to execute these complex maneuvers while under constant threat from German fighters scanning for exactly the kind of attack they were attempting. The development of systematic sun-based tactics began during the early phases of the Battle of Britain, when individual pilots discovered the effectiveness of attacking from sun-concealed positions. These isolated successes gradually evolved into coordinated, squadron-level tactics as experienced pilots shared their techniques and squadron leaders incorporated sun positioning into their operational planning. The transformation was neither immediate nor uniform, but it accelerated as the tactical advantages became undeniable. Training programs at Royal Air Force flying schools began emphasizing sun awareness as a fundamental survival skill. Pilots learned to constantly monitor the sun's position relative to their aircraft and potential threats. They practiced maneuvering to maintain optimal positioning while engaging in combat. They studied how different times of day and weather conditions affected the visibility advantages provided by sun-based approaches. Most importantly, they learned to think of the sun not as an environmental factor to be managed, but as a tactical weapon to be employed. The systematic adoption of these tactics throughout fighter command created a unified approach that maximized the defensive advantages available to British pilots. Squadron leaders like Adolf Mallen incorporated sun positioning into their tactical briefings, ensuring that all pilots understood how to use natural light conditions to their advantage. The widespread implementation of sun-based attack methods meant that German formations faced consistent tactical pressure from defenders who could approach undetected and strike without warning. The effectiveness of sun-based tactics was enhanced by the integration of radar early warning systems with tactical planning. British controllers could vector fighters into optimal positions relative to both the sun and incoming German formations, creating opportunities for surprise attacks that would have been impossible without advance warning. The coordination between ground-based radar operators and airborne fighters created a feedback loop that continuously improved the effectiveness of sun-based attack tactics throughout the Battle of Britain. The timing of British fighter deployments, guided by radar intelligence, allowed pilots to climb to advantageous altitudes and position themselves between the sun and incoming German formations well before visual contact was made. This systematic approach to air defense meant that German bomber crews often found themselves under attack from fighters that seemed to materialize from empty sky, guns blazing from positions that should have been clearly visible, but remained hidden in the sun's glare. German pilots quickly recognized the threat posed by sun-based attacks, but found themselves limited in their ability to counter these tactics. The fundamental challenge was that spotting aircraft positioned in the sun required looking directly into blinding light, which was physically impossible for extended periods. German formations could attempt to position themselves advantageously relative to the sun, but their role as attackers constrained their tactical flexibility. They had specific targets to reach and defensive responsibilities to their bomber formations that prevented the kind of patient positioning that British defenders could employ. The psychological impact of sun-based attacks on German aircrew was significant and cumulative. The constant threat of unseen fighters appearing from the sun's glare created additional stress and reduced the effectiveness of Luftwaffe formations. Bomber crews found their attention divided between their primary mission and the necessity of scanning for threats that might not be visible until it was too late to respond. Fighter escorts faced the impossible task of protecting their charges from attacks they could not see coming. As British pilots refined their sun-based attack techniques, they discovered additional tactical advantages beyond simple concealment. The temporary blindness experienced by German pilots looking into the sun created opportunities for British fighters to close to extremely short range before opening fire. This proximity dramatically increased the accuracy and lethality of British attacks, as pilots could wait until they were certain of hitting their targets before expending ammunition. The development of formation tactics that maximize sun-based advantages required extensive coordination and practice. British squadrons learned to approach German formations from multiple angles, with some fighters attacking from sun-concealed positions, while others engaged from different directions. This coordinated approach prevented German fighters from focusing their defensive efforts in a single direction and created opportunities for devastating surprise attacks on bomber formations. The success of sun-based tactics during the later phases of the Battle of Britain demonstrated the power of systematic tactical innovation. British pilots learned to combine altitude advantage, sun positioning, and enemy vulnerability into coordinated attacks that maximized their effectiveness while minimizing their exposure to German defensive fire. The timing of these attacks was crucial, as German fighters were most vulnerable during their return journey, when fuel was running low and pilot attention might be focused on navigation rather than defensive scanning. The tactical pattern that emerged during the autumn months of 1940 revealed the full sophistication of British sun-based warfare. Rather than random opportunistic attacks, RAF squadrons developed systematic hunting techniques that transformed defensive operations into coordinated, predatory campaigns. Flight commanders learned to position their aircraft in patrol patterns that maintained optimal sun angles throughout extended periods, creating persistent threat zones that German formations could not avoid or predict. The coordination required for these operations involved multiple levels of command working in seamless integration. Sector stations tracked incoming raids and calculated optimal interception points that would place British fighters between the sun and approaching German formations. Squadron leaders received vectoring instructions that positioned their aircraft for maximum concealment while maintaining adequate fuel reserves for extended combat. Individual pilots executed precise maneuvers that kept them hidden in the sun's glare while approaching targets that remained clearly visible against darker backgrounds. This systematic approach created a force multiplication effect that allowed smaller numbers of British fighters to engage larger German formations on favourable terms. A single squadron, positioned correctly relative to the sun, could devastate bomber formations that should have been protected by superior numbers and escort fighters. The psychological impact of these attacks extended beyond immediate tactical results, creating persistent anxiety among German aircrew who never knew when invisible defenders might emerge from the blazing sky above them. The evolution of British gunnery techniques specifically adapted to sun-based attacks represented another dimension of tactical innovation. Pilots discovered that approaching from sun-concealed positions allowed them to close to extremely short range before opening fire, dramatically increasing their hit probability and ammunition efficiency. Traditional fighter combat doctrine emphasized longer-range engagements where pilots opened fire at maximum effective distance to avoid enemy defensive fire. Sun-based attacks reversed this logic, allowing British pilots to hold their fire until they achieved near-certain accuracy. The training programs that developed around these techniques required pilots to master skills that went far beyond basic marksmanship. They learned to judge distances accurately while approaching targets silhouetted against varying backgrounds. They practiced controlling their aircraft precisely during high-stress approaches, where detection meant immediate vulnerability to defensive fire. They developed the patience and discipline necessary to maintain concealment until the optimal firing position was achieved, resisting the temptation to open fire prematurely and reveal their position. Squadron commanders like Mullen codified these techniques into systematic training protocols that could be taught to replacement pilots arriving from training schools. The institutionalization of sun-based attack methods ensured that tactical knowledge accumulated rather than being lost when experienced pilots were killed or wounded. New pilots learned not just individual techniques, but comprehensive tactical systems that integrated sun positioning with formation flying, communication procedures, and ammunition management. The German response to British sun-based tactics revealed both the effectiveness of these methods and the fundamental challenges they posed for attacking forces. Luftwaffe commanders recognized the threat and attempted to develop countermeasures, but found themselves constrained by the basic requirements of their strategic mission. German formations could not simply avoid sun-disadvantageous positions because their targets were fixed geographical locations that had to be reached regardless of tactical considerations. German fighter escorts attempted to position themselves to scan sun-concealed approach routes, but this defensive posture reduced their ability to provide close protection for bomber formations. The division of attention required to guard against sun-based attacks while maintaining formation discipline and protecting vulnerable bombers created tactical dilemmas that German commanders never fully resolved. Every defensive measure implemented to counter British sun tactics created new vulnerabilities that British pilots learned to exploit. The technological limitations that prevented effective countermeasures to sun-based attacks highlighted the fundamental nature of this tactical advantage. No amount of engineering innovation could solve the basic problem of human vision limitations when looking into bright light. German aircraft designers could not create systems that allowed pilots to see clearly while staring directly into the sun. This biological constraint created an asymmetric advantage that British pilots could exploit consistently throughout the battle. The seasonal progression of the Battle of Britain created changing conditions that British pilots learned to exploit through adaptive, sun-based tactics. The angle and intensity of sunlight varied significantly between summer and autumn months, requiring continuous adjustment of attack techniques and timing. British pilots developed expertise in predicting how different weather conditions would affect visibility advantages, allowing them to plan attacks that maximized their concealment while maintaining effective gunnery solutions. The integration of meteorological intelligence with tactical planning became a crucial element of British defensive operations. Weather forecasters provided detailed information about cloud cover, visibility conditions, and sun angles that allowed squadron commanders to optimize their attack planning. This scientific approach to tactical aviation represented a significant advance over traditional fighter combat methods that relied primarily on individual pilot instincts and basic formation tactics. The cumulative effect of systematic sun-based attacks on German bomber effectiveness became apparent as the battle progressed through September and October 1940. Bomber formations that should have been able to deliver concentrated attacks on British targets found themselves under constant harassment from fighters that appeared without warning from sun-concealed positions. The accuracy of German bombing declined as aircrew attention was divided between navigation, target identification, and defensive scanning for threats that might not be visible until the moment of attack. German bomber losses mounted as British pilots perfected their sun-based attack techniques, but the psychological impact proved equally significant. The constant stress of potential invisible attack created fatigue and reduced effectiveness that extended beyond immediate combat encounters. German aircrew returned from missions over Britain, reporting encounters with British fighters that seemed to possess supernatural ability to appear and disappear at will, creating morale problems that German commanders struggled to address. The tactical success of sun-based attacks created opportunities for British pilots to engage German formations at times and places of their own choosing. Rather than reacting defensively to German initiatives, British squadrons could position themselves proactively to intercept incoming raids under optimal conditions. This shift from reactive to proactive tactics represented a fundamental change in the nature of the air battle over Britain. The development of coordinated multi-squadron attacks that maximized sun-based advantages required unprecedented levels of tactical coordination and communication. British controllers learned to vector multiple squadrons into positions where they could attack the same German formation simultaneously from different sun-concealed approach routes. These coordinated attacks created overwhelming local superiority that could devastate German formations regardless of their overall numerical advantages. The timing precision required for these coordinated attacks pushed British operational capabilities to their limits. Controllers had to calculate interception points that would allow multiple squadrons to arrive at optimal positions simultaneously while maintaining their concealment until the moment of attack. Pilots had to execute complex approach maneuvers while maintaining radio silence and formation discipline under conditions where any mistake could expose their presence to German defenders. The success of these advanced tactical systems demonstrated that British pilots had transformed sun-based attacks from individual opportunistic techniques into systematic operational methods that could be employabilization of these tactics within fighter command consistently and effectively. The Institute created a sustainable advantage that German forces could not counter through conventional means. The mathematical precision required to execute coordinated sun-based attacks revealed the sophistication British pilots had achieved by late 1940. Squadron leaders calculated approach vectors with the accuracy of artillery officers, factoring in sun angle, target speed, formation density, and fuel consumption to create attack solutions that maximized lethality while minimizing exposure. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey of 501 Squadron developed charts showing optimal attack angles for different times of day and seasonal conditions, transforming what had begun as intuitive individual tactics into systematic operational science. The training evolution that supported these advanced techniques required fundamental changes in how fighter command prepared its pilots. Traditional flying schools had emphasized basic aircraft handling and formation discipline. The demands of sun-based warfare required pilots who could think three-dimensionally while managing complex approach calculations under life-threatening stress. New training programs incorporated mathematics, physics, and tactical planning alongside conventional flying skills. Instructor pilots who had survived the early phases of the battle became invaluable resources for developing training curricula that reflected actual combat conditions. Squadron leader Peter Townsend established advanced tactical schools where experienced pilots taught replacement crews the specific skills required for sun-based attacks. These programs condensed months of combat experience into intensive courses that prepared new pilots for the tactical realities they would face over Britain. The psychological preparation required for sun-based attacks proved as important as technical training. Pilots had to develop the confidence necessary to approach enemy formations that remained clearly visible while trusting that their own aircraft remained concealed. This required overcoming natural instincts that warned against flying directly toward heavily armed enemy aircraft. The mental discipline needed to maintain concealment until optimal firing position was achieved demanded training methods that pushed pilots beyond conventional comfort zones. Combat veterans developed techniques for managing the intense stress of sun-based approaches. Flying officer Brian Kingcombe of 92 Squadron described the experience as requiring complete faith in physics and positioning while suppressing every instinct that screamed danger as enemy aircraft grew larger in the gun sight. The ability to remain calm and precise during these high-stress approaches separated successful pilots from those who broke concealment too early or failed to achieve effective firing solutions. The technological adaptations that enhanced sun-based attacks extended beyond aircraft modifications to include specialized equipment and procedures. British armourers developed ammunition loading patterns that maximized the effectiveness of close-range attacks typical of sun-based engagements. Tracers were positioned to provide aiming reference without revealing aircraft positions prematurely. Cannon and machine gun harmonization was adjusted to create devastating firepower concentrations at the short ranges characteristic of surprise attacks. Radio procedures evolved to support coordinated sun-based attacks while maintaining operational security. Pilots developed code words and abbreviated communications that allowed coordination without revealing tactical intentions to German radio intercept services. Ground controllers learned to provide vectoring information that positioned fighters optimally without explicitly describing attack plans that enemy listeners might decode. The maintenance requirements for aircraft conducting intensive sun-based operations created new challenges for ground crews. The high-stress maneuvering required for optimal positioning placed unusual demands on aircraft systems. Engine temperatures fluctuated rapidly during climbs to sun-advantageous positions. Control surfaces experienced extreme loads during precise approach maneuvers. Ammunition consumption patterns differed significantly from conventional combat, requiring adjusted resupply procedures. Chief technicians like Flight Sergeant George Powell developed maintenance schedules specifically designed to support sun-based tactical operations. Aircraft were inspected for stress points that might fail during high-load positioning maneuvers. Engine cooling systems received additional attention to handle the thermal cycles of rapid climbs and descents. Gun systems were calibrated more frequently to maintain the accuracy essential for close-range surprise attacks. The intelligence requirements for effective sun-based warfare expanded beyond traditional reconnaissance to include detailed meteorological and astronomical data. Weather officers provided forecasts that included visibility predictions, cloud cover analysis, and sun angle calculations throughout projected mission timeframes. This scientific approach to tactical planning represented a significant advance over previous fighter operations that relied primarily on general weather information. Photographic reconnaissance units adapted their procedures to support sun-based attack planning. Intelligence officers analyzed German formation patterns to identify vulnerability windows when bomber streams would be most susceptible to sun-concealed attacks. Route analysis provided information about German approach patterns that allowed British controllers to position fighters at optimal interception points with maximum sun advantage. The development of night adaptation techniques enhanced the effectiveness of sun-based attacks during dawn and dusk periods. British pilots learned to preserve their night vision while maintaining awareness of sun positioning during low-light conditions. These techniques allowed effective attacks during twilight periods when German formations might be silhouetted against lighter backgrounds, while British fighters remained concealed in darker sky regions. Medical officers studied the physiological demands of sun-based combat to develop procedures that maintained pilot effectiveness during extended operations. Vision specialists provided training and techniques for managing rapid light adaptation changes during attack approaches. Flight surgeons developed protocols for identifying pilots whose vision capabilities made them particularly effective for sun-based operations. The logistics of supporting intensive sun-based operations required comprehensive planning that extended throughout fighter command supply chain. Fuel consumption patterns differed from conventional operations due to the climbing and positioning requirements of sun-based tactics. Ammunition expenditure rates varied significantly because pilots could achieve higher hit probabilities through close-range surprise attacks. Supply officers calculated consumption rates based on tactical analysis rather than historical averages. Fuel trucks were positioned to support rapid turnaround times for squadrons conducting multiple sun-based sorties daily. Ammunition supplies were adjusted to reflect the different usage patterns characteristic of surprise attacks versus conventional fighter engagements. The communication networks that coordinated sun-based attacks required sophisticated technical capabilities and operational procedures. Filter rooms processed radar information to identify German formations early enough to allow British fighters to climb to advantageous positions. Sector stations calculated interception vectors that would place fighters between the sun and approaching enemy aircraft. Operations room personnel developed plotting techniques that tracked multiple variables simultaneously. Sun angles were calculated and updated continuously throughout the day. German formation positions were projected forward to predict optimal interception points. British squadron positions were monitored to ensure fighters could reach advantageous locations with adequate fuel reserves for combat and return. The tactical flexibility that sun-based attacks provided allowed British commanders to implement strategic deception operations. False radio traffic could suggest British fighters were positioned in areas where they would be visible to German reconnaissance, while actual squadrons approached from sun-concealed directions. These deception efforts multiplied the psychological impact of surprise attacks by creating persistent uncertainty about British defensive positions. Counterintelligence operations supported sun-based tactics by providing misleading information about British tactical methods. German intelligence services struggled to understand how British fighters consistently achieve surprise despite apparent German advantages in numbers and positioning. Captured German documents revealed confusion about British capabilities that exceeded the actual technical advantages of their aircraft. The seasonal adaptation of sun-based tactics required continuous tactical evolution as daylight patterns changed throughout the battle period. Summer operations utilized different approach angles and timing compared to autumn engagements. British pilots developed expertise in adjusting their techniques to maintain effectiveness as sun angles shifted with the changing seasons. Training programs incorporated seasonal tactical variations to ensure pilot effectiveness throughout varying conditions. Mock combat exercises simulated different sun angles and weather conditions. Pilots practiced approach techniques for dawn, midday, and evening conditions. This comprehensive preparation ensured that British squadrons could maintain their tactical advantages regardless of seasonal changes. The cumulative impact of systematic sun-based attacks on German strategic planning became apparent as Luftwaffe commanders struggled to maintain bomber effectiveness despite numerical superiority. German losses mounted not just from direct combat casualties, but from reduced bombing accuracy caused by constant harassment from invisible attackers. Mission planners found it increasingly difficult to develop routes that avoided sun-disadvantageous positions while still reaching assigned targets. The strategic implications extended beyond immediate tactical results to affect German confidence in their ability to achieve air superiority over Britain. High Command assessments revealed growing concern about British defensive capabilities that seemed to exceed the performance limitations of their aircraft. German intelligence struggled to explain how British pilots consistently achieved tactical advantages despite operating inferior numbers of fighters. Luftwaffe tactical manuals were revised to address the threat of sun-based attacks, but German commanders found it difficult to implement effective countermeasures. The fundamental challenge remained that German formations had specific targets to reach and could not simply avoid tactically disadvantageous positions. Every route adjustment made to minimize sun-based attack vulnerability created new problems for navigation, fuel consumption, or exposure to other British defensive measures. The morale impact on German aircrew became a significant factor as sun-based attacks created persistent anxiety about invisible threats. Bomber crews reported difficulty concentrating on their primary missions while constantly scanning for fighters that might not be visible until the moment of attack. Fighter escorts found their effectiveness reduced by the necessity of dividing attention between close protection duties and defensive scanning against concealed threats. German pilot training programs attempted to address sun-based attack threats through enhanced lookout procedures and formation adjustments. However, the fundamental biological limitation of human vision when looking into bright light could not be overcome through training or tactics. German pilots learned to recognize the threat but remained unable to effectively counter attacks they could not see developing. The technological solutions attempted by German engineers proved inadequate to address the fundamental challenges of sun-based warfare. Improved aircraft canopies provided better visibility, but could not solve the basic problem of seeing aircraft positioned directly in the sun's glare. Optical equipment designed to reduce sun glare proved impractical for combat use. An added weight that reduced aircraft performance? The intelligence failures that prevented effective German countermeasures to sun-based attacks revealed limitations in Luftwaffe reconnaissance and analysis capabilities. German intelligence services consistently underestimated the systematic nature of British sun-based tactics, treating them as individual pilot initiatives rather than coordinated squadron-level operations. This misunderstanding prevented development of appropriate countermeasures. The strategic reassessment forced on German commanders by the effectiveness of sun-based attacks contributed to fundamental changes in Luftwaffe operational planning. Daylight bombing missions became increasingly costly as British pilots perfected their invisible attack techniques. German losses reached levels that threatened the sustainability of the air offensive against Britain. The tactical revolution achieved through systematic sun-based warfare demonstrated principles that extended far beyond the specific techniques employed. British pilots had proven that natural phenomena could be weaponized through systematic understanding and coordinated implementation. Environmental factors previously considered neutral elements of combat had been transformed into decisive tactical advantages. The organizational learning that enabled this transformation revealed the importance of systematic knowledge, capture, and dissemination. Individual pilot discoveries had been institutionalized into squadron-level tactics and eventually into command-wide operational doctrine. This progression from individual innovation to systematic implementation created sustainable advantages that could be maintained and improved over time. The scientific approach to tactical development represented a fundamental shift in military thinking about fighter combat. Mathematical analysis, meteorological data, and systematic experimentation had replaced traditional reliance on pilot instincts and conventional wisdom. This evidence-based approach to tactical innovation created capabilities that exceeded what individual skill and courage could achieve alone. The precision measurement of sun-based attack effectiveness required documentation methods that went beyond traditional combat reporting. Squadron intelligence officers developed detailed analysis forms that tracked approach angles, engagement ranges, hit percentages, and enemy reaction times for each sun-concealed attack. This systematic data collection revealed patterns that allowed continuous refinement of tactical procedures. Flight Lieutenant Douglas Bader's 242 Squadron maintained meticulous records showing that attacks initiated from within 15 degrees of the sun's direct glare achieved hit rates exceeding 70%, compared to conventional attacks that averaged less than 30% effectiveness. Statistical analysis of these engagement reports provided mathematical validation for tactical decisions that had initially relied on pilot intuition. The numbers were undeniable. Sun-based attacks required less ammunition per kill, resulted in fewer British casualties, and created higher levels of damage to German formations. Squadron commanders could justify tactical changes based on quantifiable performance improvements rather than subjective assessments of pilot preferences or traditional combat doctrine. The data revealed unexpected secondary effects that multiplied the value of sun-based tactics beyond direct combat results. German formations subjected to sun-concealed attacks showed measurably reduced bombing accuracy on subsequent target runs, even when the attacks themselves caused minimal immediate damage. The psychological disruption created by invisible threats proved as valuable as physical destruction in degrading German operational effectiveness. Combat film analysis provided visual confirmation of phenomena that pilots had reported, but commanders had initially questioned. Gun camera footage showed German pilots taking evasive action against threats they clearly could not see, their aircraft maneuvering frantically while British fighters remained completely invisible in the sun's glare until the moment weapons were fired. These recordings became training materials that demonstrated proper approach techniques to new pilots, while validating the effectiveness of systematic sun-based warfare. The development of specialized equipment to support sun-based operations extended to modifications that enhanced pilot effectiveness during high-stress surprise attacks. Gun sight adjustments, optimized for close-range engagements, improved hit probability during the brief firing opportunities, typical of sun-concealed approaches. Cockpit mirrors were repositioned to provide better visibility of sun angles during combat maneuvering. Oxygen system modifications supported the high-altitude climbs required for optimal positioning relative to incoming German formations. Aircraft armourers developed loading procedures specifically designed for sun-based attack profiles. Ammunition belts were configured with tracer rounds, positioned to provide aiming reference without revealing aircraft positions prematurely. High explosive rounds were concentrated in belt sections most likely to be fired during close-range surprise engagements. These technical adaptations reflected the systematic approach British forces applied to every aspect of sun-based warfare. The coordination requirements for multi-squadron sun-based attacks pushed British communication capabilities to their operational limits. Operations rooms developed plotting boards that tracked sun angles, German formation positions, and British squadron locations simultaneously. Controllers calculated interception vectors that would place multiple fighter units in sun-concealed positions at precisely timed intervals. The mathematical precision required for these calculations approached the complexity of naval gunnery problems. Radio procedure innovations supported coordinated attacks while maintaining operational security against German interception efforts. Code words indicated sun positioning without explicitly describing tactical intentions. Time synchronization protocols ensured multiple squadrons could execute simultaneous attacks from different sun-concealed approach routes. These communication advances enabled tactical coordination that had been impossible during earlier phases of the battle. The training pipeline modifications required to produce pilots capable of effective sun-based warfare created bottlenecks that Fighter Command struggled to manage. Advanced tactical training took longer than conventional pilot preparation, but the combat effectiveness gains justified extended training periods. Instructor pilots who had mastered sun-based techniques became invaluable resources whose knowledge needed systematic preservation, and transmission to replacement crews arriving from flying schools. Combat veteran pilots developed mentoring relationships with newcomers that accelerated the learning process for sun-based tactics. Experienced pilots shared techniques for managing the psychological stress of approaching enemy formations while remaining concealed. They taught methods for calculating approach angles under combat conditions when mathematical precision had to be achieved while under fire from German escorts who might spot attacking fighters at any moment. The maintenance implications of intensive sun-based operations required adaptations throughout Fighter Command's technical support structure. Aircraft conducting multiple high-altitude climbs to sun-advantageous positions experienced accelerated engine wear patterns. Oxygen systems required more frequent servicing due to extended high-altitude operations. Control surface mechanisms needed additional attention because of the precise maneuvering required for optimal attack positioning. Ground crew training programs incorporated the specific requirements of supporting sun-based tactical operations. Technicians learned to recognize stress patterns in aircraft systems that reflected the unique demands of this combat method. Turnaround procedures were optimized to minimize the time between missions for squadrons conducting multiple sun-based sorties throughout extended daylight periods. The intelligence requirements for effective sun-based warfare expanded to include astronomical calculations that had never been necessary for military operations. Weather officers provided sun angle predictions with the precision previously reserved for artillery fire control. Meteorological forecasts incorporated visibility assessments that factored in atmospheric conditions affecting the concealment provided by sun positioning. Reconnaissance units adapted their procedures to support sun-based attack planning through detailed analysis of German formation characteristics. Intelligence officers identified vulnerability patterns in Luftwaffe bomber streams that could attacks. Route analysis provided information about be exploited through coordinated Sun-Konst German approach, timing that allowed British controllers to position fighters at optimal interception points with maximum sun advantage. The medical support requirements for pilots conducting intensive sun-based operations included vision care that addressed the unique demands of this combat method. Flight surgeons monitored pilots for eye strain and vision problems that could result from repeated exposure to high-intensity light conditions. Specialized equipment was developed to test pilot vision capabilities under conditions that simulated the light contrasts encountered during sun-based attacks. Physiological research revealed that pilots varied significantly in their ability to maintain visual effectiveness during rapid transitions between bright and dark conditions. Medical officers developed selection criteria that identified personnel whose vision characteristics made them particularly effective for sun-based operations. These discoveries led to specialized training programs that maximized individual pilot capabilities for this demanding combat method. The logistics challenges of supporting widespread sun-based operations required comprehensive planning that affected every aspect of fighter command supply chain. Fuel consumption patterns differed from conventional operations because of the climbing requirements for optimal sun positioning. Ammunition expenditure rates reflected the higher hit probabilities achieved through close-range surprise attacks enabled by sun concealment. Supply calculations incorporated tactical analysis rather than historical consumption averages. Transportation schedules were adjusted to support the rapid resupply requirements of squadrons conducting intensive sun-based operations. Storage facilities were positioned to minimize the time between mission completion and aircraft preparation for subsequent sorties. The strategic deception opportunities created by sun-based tactics allowed British commanders to implement sophisticated operational security measures. False information about British defensive positions could be provided to German intelligence services while actual squadrons approached from sun-concealed directions. These deception efforts multiplied the psychological impact of surprise attacks by creating persistent uncertainty about British capabilities and positioning. Counterintelligence operations supported sun-based tactics by reinforcing German misconceptions about British technical capabilities. Captured German assessments revealed confusion about how British pilots consistently achieved tactical advantages that seemed to exceed their aircraft specifications. This strategic deception protected the systematic nature of British sun-based warfare by encouraging German commanders to attribute British success to superior equipment rather than tactical innovation. The seasonal variations in sun-based tactical effectiveness required continuous adaptation of procedures and training programs. Summer operations utilized different approach angles compared to autumn engagements as sun elevation changed throughout the battle period. British pilots developed expertise in adjusting their techniques to maintain effectiveness as daylight patterns shifted with advancing seasons. Advanced training programs incorporated seasonal tactical variations to ensure pilot effectiveness under varying conditions. Mock combat exercises simulated different sun angles and atmospheric conditions throughout annual cycles. Pilots practiced approach techniques for dawn, midday, and dusk conditions across different seasonal periods. This comprehensive preparation ensured British squadrons could maintain tactical advantages regardless of environmental changes. The cumulative strategic impact of systematic sun-based attacks on German operational planning became apparent as Luftwaffe commanders struggled to maintain mission effectiveness despite numerical superiority. German losses mounted through direct casualties and reduced operational efficiency caused by constant harassment from invisible attackers. Mission planning became increasingly complex as commanders attempted to develop routes that minimized sun disadvantageous positioning while still reaching assigned targets. The transformation was complete. By November 1940, British pilots had proven that the greatest weapons were not always the most complex. They had taken an ancient principle, older than aviation itself, and forged it into a systematic tactical revolution that blinded the Luftwaffe and saved Britain from invasion. The sun that had risen over countless battlefields throughout history became, in the hands of fighter command, the invisible sword that cut through German formations and shattered the myth of Luftwaffe invincibility. This was warfare transformed through understanding rather than technology, victory achieved through knowledge rather than numbers, and proof that sometimes the most powerful innovations come not from laboratories, but from pilots willing to see familiar things in revolutionary ways.